Day after the Wagner Group halted its advance towards Moscow and stopped a possible confrontation with the Russian military, Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin, in his first statement since the revolt, has said that he turned around to avoid Russian bloodshed. Prigozhin said the march was a demonstration of protest and not intended to overturn power in Russia. In an audio clip released by him, he said that the current situation in Russia is stable and the contemporary position of President Putin is absolutely stable. That's the pitch coming in from Prigozhin. Wagner Group recruitment centers in the Russian cities of Tyumen and Novosibirsk have resumed operations following temporary closures over the weekend. Meanwhile, in a video released by the Russian Defense Ministry, the nation's defense minister visited troops in Ukraine, marking his first public appearance since the Wagner Mutiny.
Но взятие Бахмута.
We didn't march to overthrow Russia's leadership and turned around to avoid spilling the blood of Russian soldiers. We regret that we had to hit Russian aviation.
Попытки Министерства обороны.
Our march aimed to prevent the destruction of Wagner. We wanted to hold accountable those who made mistakes during the special military operation.
И приведет к глобальной трагедии для России.
Recently, our country has faced another challenge. An attempt was made to destabilise the situation inside the country. Members of government remained in their offices. They acted clearly and united under presidential guidance. The situation was kept stable at all levels, in order not to allow the situation to deteriorate and to protect citizens from all possible threats.
Notably, noting the destabilizing impact of the tensions between the Wagner Group and President Putin, the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has said that Britain is preparing for a range of scenarios in Russia. Sunak further said that it's a situation that Britain has been analysing and monitoring carefully, as there could be potential destabilizing impact of Russia's illegal war in Ukraine.
Yes, I've spoken to the leader of the United States, but also France and Germany over the weekend. We're completely coordinated on our response to this. It's a situation that we've been monitoring for some time, the instability that would be caused by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And what we saw over this weekend is an example of that coming to the fore. It's obviously too early to predict with certainty what might happen as a result of this, but I'm in close touch with our allies and we're monitoring the situation closely. We're aware of the potentially destabilizing impact of Russia's illegal war on Ukraine and indeed the tensions between the Wagner Group and the Putin regime. That's why we're in close touch with our allies to make sure that we're coordinated. It's too early to predict with certainty what the consequences of this might be, but of course we are prepared, as we always would be, for a range of scenarios.
This additional support will make a real difference, helping the Ukrainian people who continue to show great courage in the face of Russia's illegal, unprovoked and immoral war. It is sobering that 16 months on from Russia's invasion, its brutal conflict continues. And we'll continue to engage with Ukraine for as long as it takes to support President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine in this struggle. This is a significant commitment, but it's one that is necessary.
What is at issue in Ukraine today is the sanctity of the global rules-based order. And it is very important that Australians understand that this engages our national interest. And we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes for Ukraine to resolve this conflict on their terms.
What has happened during this weekend shows that the war against Ukraine is cracking Russian power and affecting its political system. We are certainly following closely what's happening, but it's now the moment to continue supporting Ukraine more than ever. And that's what we will do. The monster that Putin created with the Wagner, the monster is biting him now. The monster is acting against his creator. The political system is showing the fragilities, and the military power is cracking. So this is an important consequence of the war in Ukraine.
We condemn Russia's announcement about deploying nuclear weapons. This is reckless and irresponsible. We don't see any indication that Russia is preparing to use nuclear weapons, but NATO remains vigilant. If Russia thinks it can intimidate us from supporting Ukraine, it will fail. We stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Our deterrence is strong. To keep our people safe in a more dangerous world, at the summit we will take further steps with new regional plans and the forces, exercises and capabilities assigned to these plans.
And joining us on the broadcast is Ben Aris, Editor-in-Chief of BNE and former Moscow Bureau Chief of the Daily Telegraph, joining us from Berlin. Thank you, Ben, for joining us on CNN News 18. At first, it was the Wagner Group turning against Putin's war machine. Then he turned around after some shadow deal with Lukashenko. How do you read this entire situation? It was a huge jolt to Putin's war machine and his entire offensive in Ukraine as the Ukrainian forces launched that counter-offensive. And now it seems all is well. How do you read that situation? Do you think there are still tensions simmering within the Russian war machine?
Yes and no. I think what happened here is it wasn't a coup per se by Prigozhin. What happened was that his Wagner troops have been the active troops fighting the offensive war in recent months. They were used specifically on the assault on Bakhmut, which is taken back by Wagner after an 8-month battle. And really that's been the only sort of big offensive success that the Russians have carried out. However, he's been in this bitter feud with Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, and he's been increasingly vocally dismissive and critical of Shoigu. And he said that the whole armed insurrection into Rostov was not a coup. It wasn't an attempt to take power. It was specifically to try and force Putin to sack Shoigu because this rivalry had become so bad. And what triggered this was Shoigu ordered last week, on the 1st of July, all of the Wagner troops have to sign a contract with the regular army. In other words, he'd moved to take Prigozhin's private army away from him. And I think what happened is that Prigozhin, who wasn't able to stop this, I mean, the order had come down, he told his troops not to sign the contract, but he reacted to that and so made this spectacular move and walked into Rostov and took over the city. But his coup, his attempt to force Putin to sack Shoigu isn't really going to go anywhere. I mean, 25,000 troops is a lot, but it's not enough to topple the government. So I think he was forced into the position where he had to do a deal. And he took the deal because, you know, it wasn't going anywhere. So I think this is actually over for the moment, that Prigozhin has actually been ousted. His deal means that he's lost control of Wagner. That now goes under the regular army. He himself had to leave the country. He's either in Belarus or in Africa now. And the war goes on as normal. We go back to fighting on Monday, and the Ukrainians are still probing with their counteroffensive. And now the regular army, the defense ministry, has added all of these battle-hardened veterans, you know, the heroes of Bakhmut, some of the best fighters they have, to that line to defend against Ukraine.
Right. So in your opinion, what he did in Belarus, his talks with Lukashenko, this was a deal to kind of save himself? Is that your reading of this entire situation? Or do you still feel the Wagner militia, as you're pointing out, the battle-hardened Wagner fighters, are they still wild cards inside the Russian war machine?
No, I think without Prigozhin, I mean, you have to remember that this is his army, his private military company, and without him in charge of it, then they're sort of leaderless, and Shoigu has moved to take them on board. Whether the actual fighters themselves will join, whether they'll, you know, follow Prigozhin to Africa, where he has also lots of military operations in Syria, in Libya, Chad in the south, so they could just go there. They don't have to sign up. They could leave the country too. However, some of them will, because a large portion of them didn't subscribe to this insurrection in Rostov, and they are actually unhappy with Prigozhin, feel betrayed by him. And so those ones are likely to stay in Ukraine, where they've been at the brunt of the fighting. As I say, I don't think there are wild cards without a leader. They're not going to go anywhere, and there's not much they can do. I mean, the capture of Rostov was spectacular, but like I say, they don't have much hope of like taking over the rest of the country. There is a hardline faction in the Kremlin who could have used this as an excuse to have a coup and try and oust Putin, but we didn't see any sign of that. If they were going to do it, they would have done it on Saturday, as the Wagner troops were supposed to be moving towards Moscow. But there was no sign of that. And the whole thing petered out pretty quickly with this so-called Lukashenko deal.
Right, but Ben, more than anything else, we saw this when there was that drone strike on the Kremlin itself, when the building was hit by a drone. Do you think this incident with the Wagner Group turning against the Russian forces, this brings to light some level of factionalism within the Kremlin against Putin? Because we don't necessarily get a lot of information from inside the Russian government, but through such incidents, does this come to the fore that there is intense factionalism inside the Russian regime?
Certainly, we're well aware of the fractions in the Kremlin. In fact, if you watch Russia closely for a long time, they're pretty obvious. And there is a hardcore fraction of generals. There's a hardcore fraction around the FSB, and it's that fraction that Putin relies on for his power. And the investigation and talks with Prigozhin were actually led by the FSB. I think Lukashenko was just brought in at the end as a public face-saving exercise because the FSB didn't want to be associated with this too much. As to the possibility of a coup, this has been much discussed. I think although the hardline faction in the military faction in the Kremlin, they're not happy with Putin. They think he should have been much tougher, that he should have been much more ruthless and used much more violence against cities, flatten Kiev with bombs, for example, which is notably something that they haven't done apart from the odd missile that gets sent there. But the insurrection, the drones you mentioned in May, I mean, that was actually thought to be by partisans. And there is now a fifth column of partisans within Russia who are fighting against Putin. And the number of sabotage acts have doubled in the last year, according to Russia's own state media. So it's like any war. The longer it goes on, the more unpredictable it becomes. And we have lots of different moving parts here. We've got partisans, we've got Wagner, who have gone AWOL. We've got the hardline military who are unhappy with Putin. And it's what this shows, I think, is the slow sort of, not fractionalization, but the slow crumbling of the edifice as all these different forces are now being unleashed and starting to act. The partisans who came across the border and fired those drones, I mean, they expressed sympathy with Wagner, but they haven't joined, and they didn't join in that attack, and they haven't joined up formally. But that's something that might happen in the future. And particularly if the Ukrainian counteroffensive is effective and then breaks through the lines and routs the Russian soldiers who are then on the run back to Rostov, then, there's a lot more opportunity for all of these fractions to actually start grabbing these soldiers who don't want to fight anymore and doing something with them. And then we could see a collapse of morale. We could see an insurrection. I could see a large-scale mutiny. In Chechnya, that nearly happened. A third of the soldiers didn't want to fight and nearly turned their guns on their officers. So this is all looking more possible as a result of the events of the weekend.